Chapter 20. A Surprise Gift. "I'm sure," said Nancy, "that Mr. Dowd not only put the money and securities in one of these suitcases, but never removed them." "Then where are they?" Don asked. Nancy smiled. "These bags may have false bottoms." Lieutenant Gill said, "Why, of course. I should have thought of that." Kneeling down, he soon found that Nancy was right. The bottom of each bag opened up, disclosing packages of $1,000 bills and securities. "Good thinking, Nancy," said Don admiringly. "You're a whiz of a detective, all right." It took Mr. Drew and the officers several minutes to count the large sum of money and make a rough estimate of the value of the stocks and bonds. When they finished, the officer gave Carson Drew a receipt to turn over to the president of the Monroe National Bank. Meanwhile, he would take the stolen property to police headquarters and send on a detailed report. A few minutes later, Nancy's group said goodbye to the officers and returned to Mr. Drew's car. When they reached the Beach Cliff Hotel, Nancy and Mr. Drew got out. They thanked Don for all he had done. "Don't mention it." The young man grinned. Turning to Nancy, he added, "I kept my date with you yesterday after all." As he got into the driver's seat, Don said that when he returned the car to the Drews' home, he would tell Hannah Gruen what had happened. It was now very light. Nancy and her father, exhausted, could hardly wait to get a few hours' sleep. They tumbled into their beds and slept until noon, then met in the hotel dining room for a hearty brunch. "How's your head, Dad?" Nancy asked. "Sound as ever," Carson Drew said, grinning. "I don't even have a bump." "Then we have a date," Nancy told him, waving a note. "This was at the desk. I picked it up. The clerk said Jim Donnell left it a little while ago." "The date's with him?" Mr. Drew asked. "No, Laura Pendleton. She says she and the Aborns are thrilled by the news which the police relayed and would like us to come to their house as soon as possible. What do you say, Dad?" "We'll go." As Nancy finished her pancakes and sausages, she remarked that she could hardly wait to start for the Aborns' home. "I wonder if the Dowds have confessed everything and what Mr. Frednick had to say." "In my opinion, it's an open and shut case," the lawyer replied. While Mr. Drew paid the hotel bill, Nancy called a taxi, and soon the Drews were heading for Eagle Rock Lane. Reaching it, they got out of the cab and the lawyer paid the driver. Nancy slid in behind the steering wheel of her convertible as Mr. Drew got in on the other side. The motor started at once. "Good old Jim," Nancy said with a smile, and drove up the lane to the Aborn home. As she parked, the front door was opened by a woman of about 45. Her pretty face showed humor, kindness, and intelligence. After the Drews had introduced themselves, the woman said she was Marion Aborn and she had reached home in the wee small hours because her plane was late. "I've been most eager to meet you two," she added, smiling. "How can I ever thank you for all you've done?" As the callers went inside, Laura Pendleton hurried down from the second floor. After greeting Mr. Drew, she gave Nancy a kiss and exclaimed, "Everything is so wonderful! You've captured the thieves and recovered all the money, and I have the nicest guardians anyone could ever hope for. And Jacob and I have a daughter to love," said Marion Aborn, smiling fondly at Laura. Nancy asked how Mr. Aborn felt. His wife said, "Come see for yourselves," and led the way to a small study at the rear of the house. She knocked, then opened the door, and Nancy heard the steady drum of typewriter keys. Jacob Aborn was seated behind the machine. The erstwhile cellar prisoner already looked like a new man. His face was flooded with color, and his eyes were alert and happy. Now he stood up, greeted the Drews, and expressed his great appreciation for all they had done in recovering his and Laura's property. He grinned at Nancy. "First time a girl ever risked her life for me," he said. "To show my appreciation, I'm writing my adventure. You know, writing is my business. If I sell this one to a magazine, I'm going to give the proceeds to Nancy's favorite charity, the River Heights Youth Center." "Why, that's terrific!" Nancy exclaimed. Mrs. Aborn's face sobered. She said that she had not yet heard the entire story of what had happened. Before anyone had a chance to tell her, the doorbell rang. Lieutenant Gill walked in with Chief McGinnis of River Heights and another man. While Nancy greeted the officers, her father hurried to shake hands with the stranger. "This is Mr. Seward, president of the Monroe National Bank," he announced a moment later, and introduced the dignified white-haired man. The president's glance included the policeman as he said, "I want to thank all of you in person for the splendid job you did in capturing the Dowds and the 2 bank employees involved in the thefts." "There's a 4th man?" Nancy asked in amazement. Mr. Seward explained that Alma Dowd's brother, Joe Jackson, had been employed by the Monroe National Bank in their vault department for some time. He and Frednick had cooked up the scheme of taking the securities. They had done this between audits of the bank's holdings. Frednick, in his job as assistant custodian, had known exactly how to place his hands on the valuable stocks and bonds. "Frednick overheard Mrs. Pendleton's discussion with me about Laura and the large estate she would inherit someday," Mr. Seward said, "and also that Mr. Aborn would be her guardian. When Frednick learned that Laura Pendleton had a valuable jewelry collection, he instantly thought of a swindle scheme. Frednick had chanced to meet Mr. Aborn one time while vacationing at Melrose Lake. He had been amazed by the strong resemblance between Aborn and Stumpy Dowd, whom Alma's brother had introduced to Frednick. He asked Dowd to impersonate Mr. Aborn and to move up the date when Laura would come to the guardian's home. He even deposited some securities with the bank in Stumpy's name, so there would be no question of Dowd's having anything to do with the thefts." "Where is Joe Jackson now?" Nancy asked. Chief McGinnis said he would answer this question. "We caught him cruising by the Drews' home. When we stopped the car, he tried to escape. After the whole story broke, we got a confession from him. He was going to burglarize your home, Nancy, to find the jewels." "There's one thing I don't understand," said Mrs. Aborn. "Why did the Dowds rent the bungalow when they had helped themselves to this house?" Nancy grinned. "I'm sure I know," she said. "Dowd was smart enough not to want either Frednick or Jackson to stay here, just in case anyone from the bank traced the thefts to them before Dowd could make a getaway. So he had Alma Dowd rent the bungalow and convinced Frednick that it was a good hideout. After Mr. Aborn and Laura had signed statements for the police, the officers and Mr. Seward left. Nancy suddenly felt a sense of loneliness and realized it was because her work on the case was at an end. Would another mystery come her way to solve, she wondered? And it did. In less than a week, Nancy was facing up to the challenge of the mystery at Lilac Inn. Nancy and her father now said goodbye to the family at Eagle Rock. As Nancy gave Laura a farewell hug, she asked, "When will you come to get your jewelry?" Laura consulted her guardian, who said the next day would be convenient for them to drive to River Heights. "Will 3 o'clock be all right?" "Yes, indeed." The following afternoon, Laura Pendleton and the Aborns arrived promptly. After iced tea and some of Hannah's delicious open-faced sandwiches, Laura whispered to Mr. Drew that she would love to get her jewelry from the safe. Excusing himself, Nancy's father left the room and returned in a few minutes with the package, which he handed to Laura. Nancy, meanwhile, was listening to Jacob Aborn's surprising news that he had finished his story and was sending it to a leading magazine. "Wonderful," said Nancy. As she said this, she looked up to see Laura standing before her. In the girl's hand was the beautiful aquamarine ring Nancy had admired earlier in the week. "I'd like you to wear this," Laura said shyly, "as a reminder that our friendship began on the water." Quickly, she slipped the ring on the third finger of Nancy's right hand. The pretty detective gave an exclamation of delight and admired the gift for a long moment. Then she showed it to the others. At last, she turned to Laura and said with genuine sincerity, "The ring is priceless, and I'll always treasure it as a reminder of you, although no one can place a value on a true friendship like ours." Seeing tears in Laura's eyes, Nancy added quickly with a grin, "Even if we had to be shipwrecked to get an introduction." The end.